The John Sweeney Lecture on the Future of Catholic Healthcare was established by St. Mary's General Hospital and the St. Joseph's Health System. It is wholly appropriate that this tribute to John Sweeney be part of the St. Jerome's Center, and we are particularly pleased that it is, and that for a number of reasons. John was one of the first lay people to be appointed to St. Jerome's Board of Governors back in the mid-70s. He was in fact our first lay chancellor to be appointed in the early 90s. It was a role he filled with distinction, with confidence, and with conscientiousness. And John and Kay, his wife, were in regular attendance at our Sunday liturgies here in this very room. For my part, as president, I had the honor of serving with John during his chancellorship, and I joined him on the board at St. Mary's Hospital for a number of years. John was a good friend to many of us. He was both serious and light-hearted. He could not only be counted on to ask the right question, the difficult question, but he also loved bemused banter. In fact, he, Al Beaupre, and I had a running joke about the impracticality of wearing the dreaded necktie on events such as tonight's. John understood full well that the necktie was Beau Brummel's contribution to sartorial silliness in Victorian England. And so even though some of you may have noticed that I've been practicing my Windsor knot lately, and I've dusted off my one and only tie, I knew that if I wore a tie tonight, that John would be the first one to be at me and bug me about it as soon as I stepped down from the podium. And I notice Al has joined me tonight in his usual tieless state. Michael Higgins, St. Jerome's president, really wanted to be with us tonight. And, of course, since he couldn't be, he did want to add a few words to the proceedings. Al said, "What is this, a wedding?" But I'd like to read you the introduction. It goes on about Herr Professor Dr. Lutzen, but I'll drop that for now. If you've been part of the banter lately, you'll know what that's about. Michael says, "I regret that I am unable..." Michael could say it, but I can't. "I regret that I am unable to attend tonight's inaugural John Sweeney Lecture because of a prior commitment in Vancouver. The Sweeney Lecture illustrates rather nicely the combined interests and passions of John Sweeney himself. Healthcare and Catholic post-secondary education were not only occasional diversions for John, they constituted a life commitment. St. Jerome's Center for Catholic Experience is proud to work with the sponsors of the Sweeney Lecture to make tonight's presentation broadly available to all those in the public interested in justice and compassion, mercy and equity in Canadian health reform. And that pretty well includes everybody, to my reckoning." So says Michael somewhere over the mountains. And now I am pleased to welcome Andre Anderson to bring greetings from St. Mary's General Hospital and the St. Joseph's Health System, and then to provide an appropriate introduction to Dr. Nuala Kenny, who, I am honored to say, is here tonight to initiate the Sweeney Lecture Series. Andre is the Vice President of the St. Mary's General Hospital Foundation and a member of the Board of Trustees at St. Mary's. He's also an old friend of John Sweeney, as well as St. Jerome's University, and many of us here tonight. Andre?
Thank you, Doug, and good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to add my own word of welcome to the inaugural John Sweeney Lecture on behalf of all of us associated with St. Mary's General Hospital. This is an important event in the life of our hospital when we honor an individual whose commitment to the public life is legendary and whose commitment to St. Mary's was equally well known. The annual John Sweeney Lecture in Current Issues in Catholic Healthcare was initiated by St. Mary's General Hospital to honor the memory of John R. Sweeney, a distinguished educator and public servant who died in July 2001. Among his many contributions to public life and to his community and church, John served on the Board of Trustees of St. Mary's for 10 years, and the hospital benefited immensely from his wisdom and commitment. John was also known to be an intellectually engaged and inquiring Catholic thinker. It seemed a most appropriate tribute to establish this lecture in his name. St. Mary's General Hospital, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Hamilton, and St. Jerome's University jointly fund this year's lecture. We are grateful for this partnership in honor of an individual who touched these three organizations profoundly. I would like to recognize Kay Sweeney and members of her family who are here tonight with us to mark this special occasion. And I would ask the Sweeney family members to please stand and be recognized. With healthcare on top of the public agenda at this time, it is especially fitting that we welcome Dr. Nuala Kenny to address the topic, Justice and Compassion in Canadian Health Reform. Not only does she represent a kind of thoughtful and critical thinking on major public issues that John Sweeney was known for, but she brings a perspective to this issue not heard often enough. On the heels of the recent Kirby Commission report, and in anticipation of the Romanow Commission on Healthcare in Canada, Canadians are searching for ways to preserve and adapt our prized healthcare system, but with a sense of justice and compassion. In this important debate, who will speak for the most vulnerable of our society? Where is the voice of John Sweeney being heard today on this most challenging issue of national importance? Sister Nuala Kenny is one such voice, much needed in the debate. She brings a wealth of experience and expertise to the topic. She is a Roman Catholic nun and member of the Sisters of Charity of Halifax since 1962. She is a medical doctor who has practiced for 30 years. Frequently consulted on public health issues by all levels of government, Dr. Kenny is past president of both the Canadian Pediatric Society and the Canadian Bioethics Society. In addition, she is chair, Department of Bioethics, Dalhousie University, Halifax. She's also former Deputy Minister of Health for Nova Scotia, chair of the Values Committee of the Prime Minister's National Forum on Health, member of Order of Canada, and recipient of 4 honorary degrees. She has written extensively on health issues, including the book, What Good is Healthcare? Reflections on the Canadian Experience. We are privileged tonight to have a speaker of such obvious distinction to inaugurate the John Sweeney Lecture on current issues in Catholic healthcare. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Nuala Kenny.
Now we'll see how sharp Andre is in response to my... It's like Vanna White. I have a lovely assistant who... I'm really pleased to be here tonight. Pleased because I see in the audience and have met already this evening again some folks that are friends of mine. But I'm also honored to be here tonight. I'm honored because when I hear the words of folks from this community in speaking of John Sweeney, for whom this lecture is named, I hear great pride, but also I hear the challenge to speak tonight in a way that John Sweeney himself would have understood and encouraged and supported. What I hear is a man who in fact understood not only his personal and professional obligations, but acted as a good citizen. And that's exactly what I want to call all of you to at the end of this reflection tonight as we approach what we know is a watershed period for Canada. Having received, as we've heard, the Kirby Report, and I bet I'm the only person in the room who's read all 6 volumes, and ready for the Romanow Report, which will be received next Thursday. This is a time where those of us who think seriously about the moral meaning of health and health care really need to be critical individuals standing in the world for justice and compassion, as I think John Sweeney would have wanted. So let me see if I can honor what I know of his reputation. So the first thing that I want to share is, we can pop that was on a minute ago. Did it turn on? There we go. The title for this lecture, I don't, yes. The first one's on, we need the thing on. There you go. It's okay. There we are. Now don't worry about, the overheads are as much a tool for me. I don't speak from a formally written paper. This is highly organized, but it's done by the notes that we see in front of us. The topic tonight is about justice and compassion in Canadian health reform. And we'll see that there are many things at stake in Canadian health reform. But I am positing for this community, in this lecture series, at the beginning of a very powerful set of lectures, I hope, that will analyze critical questions for our society, I am positing justice and compassion as in very particular ways central to what we see, hear, and do about health reform in the next 6 to 18 months. You're going to hear lots of things that are strategies. You're going to hear lots of debate about more money, how much more money, who gives more money. I want you tonight to center yourself far deeper into the question than strategies themselves. I want you to center yourself in the fundamental underlying value issues that are at stake in Canadian health reform. I've been thinking about this for a while, and while I speak much better than I write, have put out, this is now 1 month ago, this small book in anticipation of this debate that was mentioned, and because it's a little hard to get, there's some order forms at the back if anybody's interested at the end of the exercise. But the reflection here, which I'm going to share with you tonight, what good is health care? It's not simply a play on words, what good is it? But it's about what kind of a good is health care. Is health care a market good like any other? Or is health care some kind of good held in common? Some kind of social good? And for those of you who come particularly from the Christian Roman Catholic tradition, is it in some way part of the common good? That question is the central one for me, and therefore the issue of values at stake becomes central. I want you to think now differently about this debate than the way we usually start it. My mother had a 3-month wait. My husband couldn't get to see the cardiologist. I want you to go way back. And I want you to begin to think first and foremost of why it might be that every country in the Western world with a healthcare system is experiencing some kind of crisis, including the country of my birth to our south, which has no system, but is still experiencing a crisis of demand for health care that seems not to be able to be met within public or private resources. I want us to reflect for here in Canada on the particular nature of this crisis. I'm saying to you, every country in the world that has a healthcare system is having trouble keeping up with the demand for the use of science and technology for human well-being. This is not a Canadian problem. And therefore, the roots of the issue, for those of us who have healthcare systems, you do realize the crisis for the rest of the world is to get basic health care, a fundamental crisis of another kind. But for those of in the West, where we have had some system that promised responses to medical need, our question is, how do we deliver on these promises? Therefore, we need to go back to, why is it that this question of health care, here and now in Canada in the year 2002, when we are the healthiest we have ever been in human history, when we have more health professionals available to us than we have ever had in human history, when we have more money per person put into health care than ever before in human history, when we have the second highest per person expenditure on health care in the entire world, why is it that we seem to have a crisis of not enough? Not fast enough, not big enough, not new enough, not enough. So I'm pushing you way back. And I want you to begin to think that there is something about the arena of modern health care that in fact is fraught with the potential for crisis because of the meaning of a health care encounter. You've heard that in terms of my own background, I am a Roman Catholic sister, and I'm a doctor, professor of medicine. Never been an employee of a Catholic institution in my life, because all our medical schools are non-sectarian. But if we look at this issue of a health care encounter, I'm telling you that it is my belief, now that I do ethics full-time, that more persons confront fundamental questions of moral meaning in a health care encounter for themselves and their loved ones than any other place. Not in the church or the synagogue, not in the local community town hall. Persons encounter fundamental questions of moral meaning now in a health care encounter. For themselves, new baby, wife with a stroke, husband dying with cancer, mother with Alzheimer's. The fundamental moral questions that are being raised here have always been part of the human experience. In the experience of pain and suffering, we ask why? Why me? Why my son? The reality here is that in our 21st century, with the decline, I believe, of the spiritual, this question has become even more poignant. So the first thing I want you to reflect on is that there is something about health care that creates in us a dependence that is almost frightening. We are willing, I would suggest, and having been a deputy minister of health for a brief period, we are willing to, in fact, cut education costs, cut welfare costs, cut road safety, cut water safety for health care dollars. We, in fact, have been caught up in something about the belief in science and technology as a response to the human condition that makes this a very vulnerable place. And more than vulnerable, it's the place where, in fact, our own personal fears, our desires, our hopes, our inability to comprehend finitude, our inability to understand suffering plays out. So, when we talk of health care, I want you to begin your reflection on the meaning of changes to our system rooted in an understanding. And if you need to go back to a personal experience of a loved one needing care, really sick and dependent, you will in fact have no problem if you can do that. And everyone in the room, except maybe some of those of you who are quite young, should be able to do it easily. Mother, father, spouse, child, best friend, cousin, teacher, to go back to an experience where you know that what was happening in the healthcare encounter was the direct, head-on, facing issues of control and dependence, loving someone and not having any ability to control what was happening to them. In a world that privileges control and independence, fear and suffering, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of our own mortality, the fear of loss, suffering, not pain, the physical reality, but the human experience of what happens when I will not be the same person after this stroke, after this surgery, with this debilitating condition. But also questions of fidelity in care. What does illness, sickness, acute or chronic, do to relationships, do to, in fact, the kind of burdens that we must experience and bear for each other? And then, in the context of modern healthcare decisions, how do we face questions about the use of this incredibly powerful science and technology and understand what risks it brings, what harms it brings, and how we face those, making choices about the good? So, first point I'm making. Personally, I want you to root yourself, as we look at the system now, in the experience that when we come to a healthcare issue, we are in fact facing a particular kind of highly morally sensitive issue for each of us. It is fraught with fundamental questions. Now, any of you in the room who've had that experience with a loved one will know what I mean. I'm suggesting that most of you might not think that public policy is fraught with moral meaning. I bet, and I'm not a betting woman, I bet that most of you think politicians, the government, does that. John Sweeney would know well when people say, well, it's the government, it's those elected officials. What the heck, what are they doing? What's the government doing? Excuse me, gang, the last I checked, we are a democracy. And as that great philosopher Pogo once said, I have seen the enemy and it is us. I have seen government and it is us. Public policy is our communal decision-making process for Western liberal societies. You think it's tough to figure out the right and the good for yourself or a loved one in a healthcare encounter. Public policy, and all policy, by the way, whether it's about how we treat prisoners or how we treat immigrants, but policy about how we treat the ill, the dependent, the vulnerable, is profoundly a moral question. Because I can't capitulate to, what do you want to do? You're a competent adult. You want this surgery, or you want that chemotherapy? When we make public policy in an arena like healthcare, we are creating in our policy possibilities not just for ourselves, but for others. So I want you now to think not just, well, the issue of healthcare is replete with fundamental moral questions. We can be rational in discourse, sitting around a board table, but when it's your mom, your baby, your partner, that in fact is experiencing a healthcare crisis, I expect you to behave differently from a citizen in rational discourse. But I want us now to realize that public policy is a moral issue. Nothing can happen at the bedside or in the doctor's office that we don't allow the possibility for with our public policy. We decide who's in and who's out, who's covered and for what. So when we in fact encounter as we will, the specific policy recommendations of Kirby and Romanow, I want you to begin to think not about, well, it's a strategy thing, of course more money, period, zip, end of discussion. More money for what? Second highest per capita expenditure for health care, and yet childhood poverty is on the rise. More money for what? How will we accept the responsibility to impact public policy as a moral act? Now, I want to say a few more things about public policy. I'm saying that we can understand the moral nature at the bedside with our loved ones easily. I'm saying it's a bit more of a stretch for us to understand it about policy, but that is how we have to act as responsible citizens. Because, and Canada knows this in spades, I'm an American by birth, I'm a Canadian by adoption, I'm Canadian by choice, I practice medicine in this country, I've lived my entire adult life in this country by choice, because of something intrinsic now to what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. First, public policy, with that moral flavor I've tried to capture for you, in fact, is about identity. When we say, this is how we treat prisoners, this is how we treat immigrants, this is how we treat the sick, we say, this is how we are. Canadians are like this because we treat those people like that. Public policy is a manifestation of identity. Good public policy is something else again. It's prophetic. It's prophetic. Now, those of you who watch television and do the dial of prophecy, you know, is there any love in my future? Have the wrong idea about prophecy. I would hope that certainly every Christian in the room, and actually those of you, if there are any persons who come from Jewish backgrounds, for sure, prophecy is not about foretelling the future. True prophecy is about reclaiming to a people the vision of who they said they were and who they wanted to be as a people, and putting it up in front of you. You said you were the people of God. You said you were a people of compassion. You said you were a people of justice. Look at yourselves. It calls you back to something about your identity. So good public policy does this. It says, if you want to know who Canadians are, look at their public policy. And if you want to know who Canadians want to be, who they strive to be, look at their public policy. Now, does that seem nuts? Well, I don't think so. When I had the privilege of chairing the National Forum on Health, Jean Chrétien's 1995 to 1997 attempt at health reform, we will have another discussion as to why our recommendations were not taken up. We will see all of them again in the Romanow report. We saw half of them in the Kirby report. When I chaired the Values Committee of the National Forum on Health, we actually followed up on this very interesting question. What I've said theoretically about public policy and identity, you may say, what is that? But do you know something? For more than 30 years, Canadians have been saying Canadian health care is a manifestation of Canadian values. We say that. We have polling data, we have focus group data out our yin-yang. We even say it today, though we're scared about its maintenance. Listen to this. We've actually said, and historically it's interesting, there are only two things, public things, that are manifestations of, if you want to see what it means to be Canadian, and that generally means over against American. I know that as an American. Hockey and healthcare. As a little aside for all of you hockey fans in the room, hockey has been bought out. It ain't Canadian no more. And healthcare runs the same risk. Interesting. So I'm saying to you, and can validate this really in spades, we have said as Canadians repeatedly, There's something in our policy. There is no policy any American could say manifests being American. What Americans would probably refer to if they wanted a public statement is the American Bill of Rights, which is a Bill of Rights, not a policy giving privileges and services to others. Interesting personal reflection for me. But I want you now to just think a minute. When you hear about the principles of the Canada Health Act, and you look at them, they're actually a weird set of things. I'll read them for those who might not see them all and who don't know this the way I do. This is like, I say my prayers in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and I can do universal, accessible, comprehensive, portable. It's another set of prayers. We've said, in Canada, okay, in order to get federal money, and of course the feds made this a national program against the worries of the provinces about affordability by putting in $50 at the start. That's part of the debate. Healthcare has become a federal-provincial football. All right? Really interesting question when you actually realize how much federalism is at stake here. But what we said was we have a universal healthcare system for a certain set of services that are covered, and everything has never been covered. Eyeglasses have never been covered. Dental care has never been covered. We identified a set that we thought, in the days when we could do this, were easily identified. It's medically necessary. Well, I assure you, that's when our grandmas could tell you what was medically necessary. Very neat, small list of things that really were medically necessary. Okay? I mean, your grandmother would be embarrassed if she knew the kinds of things you went to the doctor for. But she would also have no ability to comprehend the power of science and technology in our lives. During the same 40 years we were developing a promise to deliver on everything medically necessary, what was being medically possible was expanding. Very, very interesting historical collision. And that's the point we're at. So the point I want to make first is, in fact, what we said was we had a public policy that the feds would give you money if you had a system where everybody, Canadian citizens and landed immigrants, were covered by a comprehensive, we tried to encompass within the coverage everything that was medically necessary, and that what you got paid for, you got services paid for if it was accessibility to doctors, to hospitals, and to what I call interventions, the machinery that you see in hospitals, X-ray machinery, MRIs, and the like. And then it was portable. Really interesting thing for Canadians, right? Whether you were a Nova Scotian sick when you were visiting in British Columbia, or a Quebecer that was, in Ontario, you could carry it province to province, even though the obligation to deliver health care is a provincial matter. And our healthcare system was publicly administered and not for profit. We'll come to that again. Okay? Now you look at those and say, how are those values? In what way do those terms for financial reimbursement translate into values? Well, I've tried to do that. That's what the reflection and the writing I've been doing lately is about. Andre, just move it up to the top so that's it. Great, thanks. Well, this is Nuala's take on what we really mean when we say these are values that are Canadian. So I'm taking the policy stuff that we say something in this structure of healthcare means something about being Canadian, and it calls Canadians to a way of being. And I'm trying to unpack it. And this is how I read it. First, in Canada, and by the way, you do realize, in every other country in the West that has universal health care, and that's everybody except the United States. The United States is the only country that has no universal coverage. Now, Canada is the exception in that we have universal coverage, but we're the exception in that we have not allowed any formal two-tier of any kind. Almost all European, Australian, New Zealand countries, etc., have a two-tier. But of all the countries that have some core of covered services for all, based on need and not ability to pay, right? Healthcare need responded to because it is a need, not based on ability to pay. That's the genius of Tommy Douglas. Right? Now, there were other groups that were moving that way, but Douglas is the icon who made this happen. First, the value that we're talking about here is a value of solidarity. Actually, we don't see that language in North America. That's a European expression about this value. We're so big and influenced by the Americans about independence. The value of solidarity says, look, when we talk about a health need, we have got to all be in the same boat. Health need is a kind of a need that has to be responded to together. It cannot be left to individuals or to their families to respond to health care need, because significant, serious health care need eats you up. In fact, the motivation in the original legislation with doctor coverage was very much about people were losing, hospital coverage, where people were literally losing the farm. As medical science and technology was advancing, it was becoming expensive enough that no individual could afford it. And yet here you are faced with the loss of your 3-year-old. So you sell the farm, you mortgage the house. So that the motivation originally was profoundly saying, wait a minute, healthcare need requires to be a civilized, compassionate country that we respond together. Other needs, hey, you're on your own. Not this one. There's something about this need we answer together. So I think solidarity over and against individualism and individual choice. Second, we said something very important about fairness. Canadians have believed that our healthcare system says something about us because it says something about the Canadian way of understanding fairness. And fairness in the Canadian conception is an equity understanding. Could you do the next one, and I'm going to get you to put this one back on for a minute. Now, this is really important. This is really important in my understanding. Remember, I'm an American by birth. Americans believe that they are the most fair people in the world. No, and in many ways they are, but they are with a different conception of fairness. The American conception of fairness is a libertarian conception, perfectly legitimate conception, and many Canadians share this conception. This is different, does not mean right or wrong, but it is different. Let me be clear. This is very important to be clear about this difference. In the libertarian conception of fairness, fairness is treating everybody exactly the same. And there's a little caveat for Americans, and not putting any obstruction in their way. Now, when you think of it for a minute, that is a way of understanding fair. Fair, I'm going to treat all of you exactly the same. Right? Lots of things, even in the most left-leaning of you, you treat with that libertarian conception of fair. Canadians have said, when we come to health need, that treat everybody the same winds up being unfair, because health need is not spread evenly or equally. We have, for health need, a different conception of fairness. It is an egalitarian, or more communitarian-oriented, it's egalitarian fundamentally in justice terms, understanding of equity. And it goes this way. To be fair, treat everybody the same, comma, taking into account substantive difference. We're saying, wait a minute. Sometimes treating everybody the same is profoundly unfair. We're saying treat people the same equally, taking into account substantive differences. And then we've said, hey, health need is substantively different. We've recognized something about this moral nature of healthcare. And we've said, this is different. This is not the same as the need for transportation. We've said this is not the same as the need for housing. We've said this is not the same as the need for adequate nutrition. Now, in some ways, that's right. We have privilege, health need. We've said if you don't have your health, you can't, in fact, enjoy any of these other possibilities. And so we've justified for ourselves that health need is different. And how do we take account of it, to be fair? We take account of it by assumption of shared risk and collective responsibility. We say the nature of this need is so unique that we have to take it into account together. Put the other one back on again just for a sec, Andre. Thank you. So the first value is we have said health need is not something that individuals themselves go seek and find an answer to. We've said there's something here about this need that requires a solidarity. We've said, to be fair, which has been incredibly important for Canadians, that health need tests our understanding of fairness. It tests our understanding of the nature of health need, and it winds up saying, if we are to be compassionate and respond to this particular kind of need, we need to recognize it is a different need from others, and we need to respond to it together. Now, I'm going to move to efficiency. Don't worry about the compassion one. Don't worry about compassion, Andre. We're going to eliminate that one. Don't leave that for a sec. I want to say something about efficiency because this is really the test. And all of you big, powerful businessmen in the room will run me out at the end of the lecture. We actually have believed in a system that should be maximally efficient. Now, we'll come to that in a second. In terms of practical efficiency, what I want you to begin to think about is the fact that we have said that this communal in-solidarity response to need that we'll give to health care as a manifestation of fairness and in recognition of the particular kind of vulnerability health need gives us requires that we understand health need and health care as different needs from those of the market. We've said health care, because of the special nature of health need, cannot be a market commodity like your car or your coat or your house. It has got to be not a market good, but a social good. Now, we learned a very interesting thing between World War I and World War II, which was incorporated into public policy after World War II. We learned that the market in the interwar years did not promote security. We couldn't trust the market for the maintenance of public goods. So the mantra post-World War II was, if you want maximal efficiency of a market good, go to the market. If you want efficiency of a public good, you go to public administration. The mantra in 2002 has reversed completely. The mantra is anything the government does, it does inefficiently, and everything the market does, it does efficiently. Garbage. Markets deliver market goods efficiently. Markets do not deliver public goods efficiently. We're really in a very interesting bind now, and Ontario is the seat of much of it. I want you to think of this carefully, and I want to just give you one way to understand. At one level, we're talking about a belief in whether or not health care is a market good or a public good, whether or not health need is in some way something to be privileged. That's at the level of belief, of personal values, and it crosses political stripe and individuals in this room. I want you to know that when you test out if health care is a public good, is it true that public goods are delivered more efficiently than market goods? And if we compare the American conception, where health care is a market good, there is limiting of risk, but it's for profit, which is what insurance companies do, limit risk for profit, you'll discover that, in fact, we are way more efficient as a system than the United States. Roughly 20 Canada goes for administration. Where do you get the better bang for your buck? And if we want to look society-wide, right, you need to understand, we're a big spender. I've already said that to you. But right now our GDP, the total expenditure, is about 9.2 or 3%. In the United States, it is the highest percentage of gross domestic product at 13.1%, and that's with arguably 40 or 50 million uninsured. Surprise, surprise. You take an issue as vulnerable as healthcare. You take advertising and competition and the need for profit in an area like healthcare, what are you going to get? I mean, I can't even begin to understand why people cannot see, even without the data, which supports my contention, that at the level of efficiency, though we have a long way to go with internal efficiencies, we can talk about that in the questions, at the level of the fundamental values at stake, we have to answer the question, do we believe health care is a public good, a good held in common, or do we have to buy that it is a market good? Because once that question, which is the essence of my little book reflection, the question of how do we go about dealing with efficiencies becomes either a central question, changing the conception of health care, or it becomes a strategic question. And then finally, I think the value of civility is at stake. Civility being the ability for us together as citizens to talk about health care. I'm going to suggest that with all the discussions about health reform, with all the discussions about reorganizing our healthcare systems in every province, every one of those discussions has had us as special interest groups over against another. The Catholic Hospital doesn't want to be closed. The Nurses Union doesn't want to lose positions. The Alzheimer's group doesn't want to have its resources cut. The Canadian Diabetic Association wants more money for diabetics. The doctors want more. I'm not saying that there's not legitimacy to any of those perspectives, but that's not how citizens decide together. I don't expect you, remember I'm a pediatrician with 30 years experience, I don't expect you when your 4-year-old is dying to not want to make sure that they've had the best available. I want you for sure as blazes not to be caught up in the hype of dangerous, risky, unproven treatments, but I expect you to be aggressive for the best that you think ought to be offered your child. I don't, however, expect when you come to sit as a citizen deciding on the future of health care to only have your own self-interest at stake. We have to learn how to do this in a better way, or we're going to lose it all. Okay, now go to the next one, which should be modern health care. No, to go to modern health care. I said we're going to eliminate compassion. This crowd is definitely not going to listen to compassion. So I'm suggesting to you that when you hear the stuff you're going to hear, that you have to try to get back to why is it that Canadian healthcare has been so meaningful to us at the level of identity. Because if it's true that it has said something important as a public policy about us, and if we see people changing not the practical options to make it work well, to make decisions, and there will be decisions about limits, being done in an open, respectful way. But if we see people saying, look, we cannot, this is a globalized society, the market rules, we have got to change the fundamentals here. Healthcare is about choice and competition. It's not about response to need and integration. That's a fundamental conflict. You've already seen it in Senator Kirby, in his promotion and the expansion of private for-profit delivery. What can you deliver privately for profit covered under the Canada Health Act other than stuff that's short, sweet, snappy, and clean? Nothing sick gets into that category. And I can assure you that when you live in a city like Halifax, we're not going to have 2 or 3 centers competing to see who can do the fastest knee surgery, because we don't have enough volume, nor physicians and surgeons with that expertise. But you're going to see fundamental value conflicts about the nature of health care, about whether or not it is a market good in this globalized, marketized world. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, if in fact we change this fundamental, the nature of this particular policy, what does that say about us? Does changing the policy change us without our intentionally changing ourselves? It can happen. It can happen. Change the policy, and it's calling us to be a different kind of people. Now I just want you very briefly, I'll be quiet and we're going to talk for a bit, but I want you to think a bit about this issue that I have raised briefly, saying, here we had this set of hopes and set of values that was developed over a 40-year period, from the time Tommy Douglas really was elected in 44, the year I was born, till 1984, the Canada Health Act. During that same 40-year period, look at what happened with modern medicine. Cardiac resuscitation, the portable ventilator, the development of immunology, which has allowed transplantation, dialysis, the science of newborn babies, the development with Watson and Crick's discovery of the double helix for DNA of modern genetics. Within a decade, less than that, the decision to map the human genome and its accomplishment. Dead is not dead anymore. Babies being some kind of human act of intercourse by 2 humans? Not necessarily. Please understand, the power of science and technology has changed every aspect of human life. Within the lifespan of at least 50% of you in this room. So as we expanded the power of science and technology, at the same time as we made a promise we'd cover everything, we now have to look at the other play on words with what good is healthcare? What good is it for us to pursue some of these ends? And how are we doing it in the midst of what is, in fact, very problematic? Most of the advances of the last 50 years in medicine have been advances for individuals. Very different than the advances of the first 50 years of the last century. In immunization, the development of public health awareness, nutrition, sanitation in the West, the whole population benefited. The last half cardiopulmonary resuscitation, dialysis, transplantation, neonatology. All of these things are benefiting individuals. All of them are benefiting individuals. And we now come to healthcare in this marketized, commercialized world in which we find ourselves with, I suggest, the same appetite for rampant individual consumption. Think I'm wrong? Think of the dilemma we have today when we have an individual who had 5 years' worth of congestive heart failure, had wonderful care, but lots of resources, and there are resources. There are resources. Then he has the need for a heart transplant, and he doesn't just get financial resources and human resources, he gets this incredibly precious resource of a human heart. And 6 months later, it is failing. Does he get a second one? The ethics of he's going to die without it, run to his rescue, would say yes. But wait a minute. He's just had not only a huge amount of our common resource, but he has a resource that in fact we can't just buy. It's a heart. If he gets a second, then your brother doesn't get a shot at one. We haven't even begun to look at the question of fair share. I'm going to end with attempting to see if I can stretch your moral imagination even more on this question. I want us to recognize that the choices that we will be making about our healthcare system, and first and foremost, let me say, there are at least 10 incredible inefficiencies in our system. The need for national home care, national pharmacare, a reform of primary care with an expanded role for health care members other than doctors. The Canada Health Act only pays for doctors and hospitals. Care is no longer delivered that way. Those are historical things that have to change. We have to have good information for patient decisions, not Nuala Kenny's homepage on the web. I may give you an interesting anecdote, but it is not good evidence on which to base a decision for yourself or a loved one. We need report cards about outcome. We need so many efficiencies that for 20 years we've been saying reform. We need a new way of paying doctors. Pay me to see you 5 times for 5 minutes rather than once for an hour, and I'll see you 5 times for 5 minutes no matter how good I am. It's what the economist Bob Evans calls perverse incentives in our system. And doctors are burning out, and yet we can't seem to be able to change the system in a new and different way. And when you demand the doctor or the cardiologist or an MRI when you don't need any of them, you're not helping, and your grandmother would be embarrassed about you. So we're going to have real efficiency questions that we now will test the public will to change and the professional will. But I want you to recognize that if anything I've said about this value question is real, if we really have to begin to think deeply about what it is that the way we've dealt with health care has meant to us as Canadians, how is it called to us as a people? Because it is fundamentally a justice redistributive agenda. Common universal health care with response to need based on need, not ability to pay, is a redistribution of resources from the wealthy and therefore the healthier to the poor who are therefore unhealthier or poor because they are unhealthier. It is, gang. Is it as fair as it could be to the rich in terms of their choices? No. Is it as fair to the rich in terms of the general well-being of the country and probably their own health care? Probably yes, but we'll have to debate that one-on-one with those of you who are wealthy. What I want you to reflect on is the context in which this debate will face us. First, the medicalization of modern life. We have not only expanded the scope of medicine, the heart transplant, the second heart transplant, okay, the cancer chemotherapies that can go on and on. We've not just expanded the power, but we've expanded the scope. Everything from making a baby to dying is now professionalized. Just look at the debacle we've been through with long-term hormone replacement therapy for women. Why did we, in fact, medicalize, as the feminists say, every aspect of the female body? If you're having a period, it's a medical problem. If you're not having a period, it's a medical problem. If you're having a baby, it's a medical problem. If you're not having a baby, it's a medical problem. Please, we have all, now of course, as equal opportunity folk, we've now invented andropause. Now we have medicalized the aging process for men. You too can remain young forever. The Lord got me for that one. Serious point as I'm trying to conclude with. We haven't even begun to think carefully about the way in which we now think of the medical. We think of it for everything. Everything. We have got to get this in hand. Cosmetic plastic surgery is the fastest growing medical specialty in North America. There are television shows now that will help you walk through cosmetic surgery. Please understand, when a plastic surgeon fixes the face of a burn victim, they are practicing in the height of the Hippocratic tradition. But they're nothing but cosmetologists when they take a perfectly normal nose and change it. Yet that act and the use of science and technology for that does affect the way we look at science and technology. It does. It affects us. So we have to be careful, particularly persons who really do reflect on the spiritual and on the ethical and moral dimensions of our lives, about the way in which life has been medicalized, about the power of technology in our lives. We're the same people with the cell phones and the email that's threatening to kill us, and the technology waking us in the morning and putting us to sleep at night, who in fact have a different familiarity with health technology. That's why the old Roman Catholic distinction between ordinary and extraordinary is no longer even usable in most dialogues, because everything is now normal. You've watched it on ER and Oprah. It is normal to you, though it is incredibly intrusive technology. Third, we have come to believe that health care is the pill or the machine. How many of you have come away from a doctor's office or had a loved one do so, and they come away saying, I told him about my problem and he didn't do anything? Because you didn't walk away with a prescription, with a referral to a specialist, or with a date for some kind of intervention, like an MRI or a scan. And you go away saying he didn't do anything. We've lost the care component, the human dimension of care. And yet in real illness and at our end, our dying, what matters most? And finally, and this is obviously the challenge that, again, those of you who come from the Roman Catholic moral tradition, Christian traditions more generally share this, and all persons, I think, of goodwill. We have to find a better way to balance individual need with this common resource. There is no health care system in the world that can provide all potential benefits for all persons. None. It means that the question that we in fact have never put before us about how do we share this scarce resource and how do we set limits is one that it will be before us for the predictable future, particularly as we look at the aging of our population. Most healthcare cost is in the last 2 years of your life, 80% on average of your lifetime cost. Most of that is in the last 2 months of your life, and much of that is in pursuit of some kind of cure or significant improvement when it is clear that medicine has met its limit. We have got to rethink the appropriate response and help persons to think through the benefits and the risks and the harms. The hype is, right doctor, right hospital, right equipment, and you'll be fixed. Not so, never so. So the challenges before us are about identity and community, and particularly here and now, how this particular understanding of health and health need has been important to us as Canadians. The challenge for us is how will we shape this policy for the next generation and the one after that and the one after that. Remember, tough as individual decisions are about the right and the good choice for health care, for yourself or your loved ones, policy determines the possibilities for others. So the questions for us, which others are in and which others are out as we make policy choices for the future of Canadian health care. A crucial time for good citizens. Thank you. That means if any of you look like you're really going to get me, you see, I don't acknowledge it. No, that's not true. Open public debate is what we have to be about. Somebody back there.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk, and the question that I was left considering is, if we're not going to just consider monetary values when we try to balance the dying process that we're all faced with, what kind of criteria would you suggest we use to use Christian values and monetary balances to give people, like babies, elderly, at what point do we say, yes, it's their time to die? Like, how do we find the balance that you've been saying that we have to find for an individual and the community?
You don't make easy questions, do you? There's a lot in what you're saying. All right, let me parse it out to something I can answer, and then something that's really, it's way too big for me. It's us. It's our question to ponder. With regard to the elderly, I go from here back to Toronto tomorrow, and then Sunday night and Monday I'm working with a group that's developing a framework for it's a grant project, a framework for looking at the question of intergenerational equity in health reform. It's a very specific aspect of this. That is, it's exactly your question. It's this question of how do you balance out, how do we begin to look at balancing out together what is owed the young, what is owed the middle-aged, because middle-aged, that's the group that's bearing the burden of the costs, right? And then what do we owe our elders in justice and respect and the like? So that's a huge question. Let me say, we have to grapple with that. I'm only beginning to think about that particular lens. But let me say something about end of life for elders, because that I've given lots of thought to. I have the privilege every month of doing an ethics round with our palliative care team in Halifax. And it's truly a privilege for me. I mean, the folks who do palliative care are, I mean, if I have hope for medicine reclaiming its sense of limits and care, it's the folks in palliative care. My God, they are just absolutely amazing. I mean, there are lots of other amazing people in healthcare, but palliative care teams are just incredible, just incredible. And I would say to you that from that experience and writing and thinking about end-of-life care, part of our problem is, particularly for elders, that we don't want to be ageist. We don't want to say, because you are 70 years of age, you can't have this, that, or the other. That's using age as a discriminatory factor. It's using age as a factor to exclude someone entirely. That's ridiculous. I mean, that age should not be a factor used that way, or that's true discrimination. That's ageism, just as it would be to say a person of color should not have this, or a person of this religious belief should not have that, or sex or gender. The question really is, how do we begin with older persons, particularly as they go into decline? See, the wonderful thing is, not only are we living older, but we're living older healthier. There's this thing that the scientists hope for, which is called a compression of morbidity, and we're seeing it a bit. What that means is that as people live better, healthier lives over their length of life, we compress the period of time in old age when you actually are debilitated and ill and needing care, right? So that your period of dependence is made smaller. The difficulty that I see for persons with, for example, terminal illness like cancer, or elderly persons who clearly are having physical decline, in and out with more than one heart attack, congestive heart failure, respiratory problems. Our problem is that with all the discussion about advanced directives and the like, we still are giving inadequate time, attention, reflection, and prayer to persons who obviously are in decline, who obviously will have a period, when the question of what should be done next is going to be on the table. We're not discussing that. Even with advanced directives, we have translated that into some kind of a form. Didn't we learn the lesson for everybody here who's in hospitals that when we did the issue of informed consent? Of course, advanced directive is only a form of informed consent. It makes no difference that your name is on the bottom of a sheet of paper. If you did not understand what the procedure was, if you did not understand the risks of that procedure, if you did not have an opportunity to ponder that question and truly put down an informed response, everybody in the room, I see Mike Coughlin, my good buddy, the ethicist, is here, would say, that's the very first thing that you would stand up and say, this is not an informed consent. I don't care you've got a signature. So with advanced directives, I don't care that you appointed somebody if you did not converse with them carefully and prayerfully about what it is that end of life might mean. We're not talking about that well enough. We're not talking about it, so we have elders who feel that the doctor wanted me to have it. What is the doctor? The doctor can only tell you what he or she might be able to provide for you. It's your decision whether or not that's a good or a risk or a harm. I don't care that your daughter wants you to have something. You have to carefully take that into account, but it's your decision. So we're not discussing these things well. The idea of limits, and then the second thing is, after discussing, we have to realize we've done something very wrong. We've developed a conception that, and I love the language is fighter. I've got to fight to the end. What the heck does it mean to fight when you're 78 years of age and you've been sick for 6 years? It's not fighting. Where do we get that metaphor? It's ridiculous. What we need to understand is you don't fight looking for a cure till suddenly you capitulate. I surrender now, and there's nothing but death. Care is about 3 different goals. 1, any use of science and technology with hope for cure. Very modern conception. Nothing to do with the Hippocratic Oath and cure. Very modern conception. First goal of medicine. Maybe in fact we'll get all better. Second, significant improvement, amelioration of symptoms. What's the third legitimate goal of medicine? Care at the end of life. It is precisely a peaceful death. It is precisely, again in the Christian tradition, to assist towards a good death. one where, in fact, what I call the last things are accomplished. Part of our problem, then, is first, we don't talk about these things. Whether it's I've seen patients in terminal cancer going home to come back in 6 weeks for yet another course of chemotherapy who have never had a careful reflection with their loved ones about what will happen if on the way home I start to bleed out, as if it's not going to happen. So somehow we have to reclaim the language of the discussion, because then we can help people plan. And many, many, many persons in those conditions will in fact not want aggressive interventions. They don't want to go to the hospital. They don't want to die in an intensive care unit. But the question is, how can we offer our support for them to die in a way that is meaningful and respectful and truly autonomous, in that it is revelatory of their own life and their values. So the whole question about when did we start believing in these machines as if they were God? When did we start talking about medical miracles? Excuse me, if it's medical, it's not a miracle. Medical means predicted with a certain potential for benefit and a certain potential for risk or harm. Miracle means God, gift, surprise. If medicine is about surprises, then I'm in the wrong business. But we use the language. We've come to believe in science and technology, even when we can see it harming us and providing more risk. But the generational equity thing, I'm just beginning to get my own head around that one. That's a tougher question. Too long an answer, sorry. Somebody else. You can criticize me. People don't have to ask questions. I sob quite quietly. Before I leave, I'll tell you my only joke. I only tell it once a year.
Thanks for your talk, Dr. Kenny. My question is, you said that you wrote a report for the Chrétien government a few years ago. It was put on the shelf, and you could tell us why if we asked you, so I'm asking you.
There was an editorial. I don't think it was the Globe and Mail. It was in some newspaper in the past 2 weeks, and actually it said, we get it as the four members of the forum still linked together on this email list, so the person sent it around to us, and it said, look, if you want to know what it is that are the efficiencies we have to deal with in our healthcare system, go back to the 1997 National Forum on Health, because we're going to hear again everything there. We all said, see, we told you. We also had a chance in February to tell that to Mr. Romanow. He brought us together. This is the problem of politics, my friends. Now, please let me get something clear. One of the things I got interviewed on CBC Information Morning last week, partly about the book and partly about Kirby. And the interviewer, Don Connolly from Information Morning, had read my book. I'm really impressed. He actually did. He marked it and everything. He and one of my brothers, I think, are the only two people who read my book. He was struck that I make a comment in the beginning of the book that I had, in this 10-month experience as Deputy Minister of Health, had this revelatory experience about how difficult it is. And my heavens, the man we're honoring tonight would know this in spades. How difficult it is to be a good civil servant or politician. Now, when I say that, please understand, I'm being dead serious. This is not some sarcastic little comment about the politicians don't know this and civil servants are all whatever, okay? We do that way too often. What I came to understand is that the political realities of people from every single solitary perspective and every self-interest pulling at a man or woman that has to make a choice for the common good, if they're attentive to what they're doing. That's what a good politician does. That's what a good civil servant does. That's what a good deputy tries to, in fact, balance, right? That I've suddenly had this revelation, truly, truly, truly honest, about how difficult it is for someone to be in that position in a pluralist society like our own and to remain good, to remain so that they're not so conflicted all the time. Now, there's a special way that spins out, and it goes right to the question. The part that was toughest for me, remember, I'm a Roman Catholic sister, okay? don't earn any of the money, don't keep any of the money I earn. When I'm home with the sisters, I'm just Nuala, right? But in the rest of my life, I'm like this big important hotshot. Okay? But I understand well. Thank God I have my community, right? Thank God I'm a baby doctor, because in all the time, the question of, and I can hear my good mother, you're getting too big for your britches, right? So putting things in perspective becomes important. But the toughest thing for me, having been chief at 2 children's hospitals, professor and head of the department, president of 2 national organizations, okay, a doctor who spent more time with dealing with dying children than anybody in this room, okay, or most of you combined. I've made tough decisions. I've accepted responsibility for them. And as deputy, you'd go to the minister, 2 different ministers, 2 different political parties, and you'd stand there. And I was doing them a favor. What could they do? Fire me? I'd go back to Dalhousie full time. It was the thing I wanted, right? But you'd stand there saying, Minister, all of the evidence says this is what the policy should be. You understand that. We've reviewed all the North American experience. We've reviewed 3 of the European countries. This is the way the policy should be. This is what I am recommending to you on behalf of the department. And they look you in the eye and say, thank you, Deputy. Minister, I'm telling you this is the way the evidence goes. Yes, Deputy, but we're doing that. Now, please, you need to understand, this is not so much political pull. It's the issue of where the evidence about the way in which a policy should go, in fact, doesn't fit with whatever the political will is. Okay? So, come back to your question. We had been given a 3-year mandate, 22 Canadians, incredible group of people. I learned more about public policy in that we wound up being 2 years because they called the government a federal election, and our mandate had to be shortened. So 2 things happened. One, we never got to year 3, which is when the recommendations from the National Forum were to be translated into strategy. Okay? But because that we had to close it down sooner, we don't think we made as compelling a case politically as to why this had to go forward. Now then there was an election. You would have thought that with the re-election of the government, that in fact they would have been in a wonderful position now to effect change. I don't know why they didn't, and it broke my heart. I think the question now for the federal Liberals and for the Prime Minister is a very serious one. I've said this now on national radio twice the past week. I think that Prime Minister Chrétien needs to understand that if he does not, when he gets Romanow and he gets Kirby together, if you compare them, they will say the same thing on about 10 different inefficiencies. Okay? They will have different strategies for 3 or 4 of those things, but then there will be tough questions, particularly about for-profit competitive stuff. They will have a different opinion on that, guaranteed. But on those 10 efficiencies on which they both agree, the Prime Minister and the federal government has only one option. That is to effect those changes. Okay? If they don't, then in fact, as I've said, I think Prime Minister Chrétien has to face the fact that he will in fact be the person who will have lost Medicare on his watch. I already think activities in this province and in Alberta are such a threat that I cannot believe that the Federal Minister of Health has not acted against them. And I will only say this to you about the redistributive agenda. Does it surprise me, coming from the Maritimes, that it is Alberta and Ontario that are leading the charge, with British Columbia right behind them? No, it does not, because it's about wealth. What you have to remember as a group is it's the middle class that determine what happens with public policy. The problem is when things are going well with the economy. That's why this is really strange, because the economy's not great right now. Huh? When things are going well, the middle class sides with the wealthy, because you think, hey, we got money, we can do this. In bad times, you're down with the folks who in fact need support. It's when, in fact, the middle class support for a program like universal health care erodes that we lose the day. So the issue is not a surprise. Of course, those who are wealthy are annoyed that they're paying for health care, because they don't consume the bulk of the health care. The wealthier you are, the healthier you are, simply by being wealthy. It's not that the wealthy don't get sick, but disproportionately it's the other way. So the question is the toughest one there is. Why is it that even when we have evidence about things that we need to change, we don't do it? But I'm answering it partly in the seeming inability of good information to get into policy, but also by recognizing this thing that I'm saying. People are pulled at. I'm going to say a funny thing, and maybe then we'll close. You know, as a as a Roman Catholic who has always been extremely influenced by and proud of the social justice tradition of our church, of the Christian churches in general, but our own church, my own church in particular, very, very proud, and worried that we don't see that and hear that preached anymore. Worried. A friend of mine has asked me, Nuala, do you want to be a priest? I don't have a vocation to be a priest, but I would love to preach. A friend said to me, Nuala, you do. And I do. I do. But, you know, if you look at all of this, and you look at the social justice tradition of our church, and that of the Christian church, standing on the side of the poor. I mean, for persons of all faiths, but that's the Christian is called to that. Somehow or other, too many of us have been too complacent. We have not seemed to understand something of what we're called to. And I said the other day to a friend of mine, you know that thing in Scripture about it's really hard for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, you know, the guy of the camel or whatever it is. You know, is that a gate or is that a needle? Or? But you know what? It is hard for a wealthy person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's not impossible, but it's hard. It is hard. And I think that we have to begin to think about all of this in a different way. And maybe I'll close with a very personal revelation. Then I'll tell you my joke. This is serious stuff, so you don't go out of here too discouraged. Personal revelation is when I was given permission to do medicine, the end of the first year I was on a retreat. Some of you may know the Jesuit Elliot McGuigan. Anybody here remember Father Elliot McGuigan? The best command of language in the whole world. He was a bit pompous, but he had wonderful command of language. Anyway, he was my retreat director. And I was 21. Dr. Janet Spade's a classmate of mine. How old was I, Janet? I don't know how old I was. But end of my first year of medical school and going then on retreat. And I was very worried about if I became a doctor that I'd be very different from the other sisters and that I wouldn't stay humble and all those things you might think about when you're younger. And I was saying this to Father McGuigan. And he asked about why was I doing medicine, and we chatted. And then he said something that stuck with me my whole life, and it's to those of you who are advantaged. He said, I was Sister Agnes Shawn at the time, my good Irish mom and dad, Agnes Shawn. He said, Sister Agnes Shawn, no one can preach a gospel of liberation to the poor if no one preaches a gospel of renunciation to the rich. That's why I'm a medical educator. Okay. Now, let me tell you my joke. It's a holy joke. Okay. A couple of priests in the room. Okay. Holy joke. Holy joke. Most of you know the story of creation. Okay. Well, you do need to know that feminist scholars who are friends of mine have told me that that story is actually all wrong, written by a man, so clearly it's wrong. The story really went like this. The first couple of days are okay. Then you get to the time when God created man. Okay. And what happened that day was God created Adam, and he put Adam in front of himself. He'd worked hard at this, huh? You know, he created Adam, and Adam was in front of him. And God was happy with everything else, the birds and the bees and the sky and the okay? And he looked at this thing, and he walked around to the back, and he looked, and he shook his head. I'm using he, please apologize. Then God walked around to the front, shook his head again, and he stood there. And God said, I can do better than that. That's when he made women.